What's the optimal way to educate citizens for democracy? Welcome to Future Hindsight, where we take big ideas in civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. Because democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. I'm Mila Atmos. We think of schools as democracy's training ground, the place where we prepare citizens to govern themselves, and we want to know if schools are really living up to that ideal. James Traub's new book, The Cradle of Citizenship: How Schools Can Help Save Our Democracy, chronicles a year observing classrooms across America and discovers genuine reasons for hope. Teachers committed to helping students think independently, scholars bridging partisan divides to create shared roadmaps for civic education, and innovative models producing citizens capable of real democratic deliberation. His findings arrive at a tender moment for democracy in this country. And before we start, if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent podcast, please join the Civics Club on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/Future Hindsight after the episode to join. Welcome, James. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So the founders believed that schools were essential to creating citizens capable of self-governance. And you spent a year going to schools across several states. There were highs and lows, of course. But first, if we believe that democracy depends on educated citizens, what are the stakes?
Well, think about the world we live in today, which I don't view as the fault of the schools, but we live in a world that is just unbelievably polarized. I mean, I'm 71 years old, and I lived through at least portions of the 60s, which is a very polarized era, but not as deeply so as it is today, not in the sense that large fractions of Americans believe things that are just completely false, not in the sense that Americans hate each other to the degree they do now, not in the sense that one political party is, I would say, captive to fictions about who America was and who America is. So what the stakes are is our national identity and our sense of collective purpose and collective being. Those are the stakes. Now, it would be unfair and I think maybe absurd to say it is school and only school that shapes our civic identity. Of course it isn't. The nature of our president shapes our civic identity. The way Donald Trump talks shapes our civic identity. Our popular culture shapes our civic identity. So I guess what I would say is I have chosen to position myself at the one place, school, which affects everybody and affects everybody from their earliest age. And I actually begin the book by quoting Horace Mann, the great educational reformer, who said the common school, which we would say is the universal public school, is America's greatest invention. Why? Because it is the means through which we communicate to everybody at a tender age the fundamental values and the knowledge that make it possible to be an effective citizen. So those are the stakes.
Yeah, well, so I'm curious about how civic education fits in more broadly, right? Because, as you mentioned, our national identity is also through popular culture, also through who's sitting in the White House, et cetera, et cetera. So in your mind, what needs to be the goal more narrowly in school about civic education, and what are the main components that must be taught?
Well, so, civic education's a funny thing because it's not a subject. Right? Physics is a subject. Biochemistry and English are subjects. Civics is not itself an academic domain. It's a set of dispositions that we want to impart. But we can only do it through academic domains, among other things. So it's a funny combination of learning through books, as you do in other domains in school, and gaining certain kinds of ways of being. For example, learning how to have civilized debate, learning that the views of others are not a sign of their ignorance, but simply a sign of their differentness from us. Learning to live in a pluralistic society, accepting the importance of being an engaged citizen. So those are dispositions. But in order to be an effective citizen of a democracy where it is, as you say, a self-governing system where it is up to us in the end to shape the country, you have to have a meaningful knowledge of our history and our government. Otherwise, you'll never understand why things are the way they are. You'll never understand how we got here. And so, for example, the fights we have today over issues like race. Well, if you don't know that even after slavery was abolished, black people lived in a system of legalized apartheid called Jim Crow in the South until quite recently in time, until, in effect, the 1960s, you're not going to have any sense of why it is that claims of racial justice mean anything. And so what I talk about in the book is not only the good examples that you mentioned at the introduction, but also the failure of the schools to teach history and government in an effective way, by which I mean in a way that allows students to think and talk about the kinds of issues they're going to face as adult American citizens.
Right. Those are really revelatory examples in your book. In fact, there's so many really great examples. But before we get to the failures, I really want to illustrate just how it could look like when it is successful. And one of my favorite stories in your book was your experience in witnessing the legislative simulation at West Chicago High School in 2023. It was the last session of a semester's long class, and the bills that they were considering were on raising the federal minimum wage, preserving affirmative action, legalizing abortion, and legalizing prostitution. Actually, first off, I was impressed by the breadth of the bills that they were going to vote on, in high school. I thought that was really good. And I was particularly struck by the bill on raising the minimum wage because I also, like you mentioned in the book, had a predisposition to believe what the outcome would be. And it wasn't like that. So it really wasn't abstract to these high school students. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, I'm happy you brought that up because it was such a great example. So this is in the suburbs west of Chicago. It's Illinois. It's a blue state. So you think, okay, I know where everything's going to come out. The school, like a lot of big public high schools in New York, is really diverse in terms of ethnicity and class. And so if I can momentarily make ethnic racial generalizations because they're very germane to the outcome, the white middle-class kids were reliably liberal in the way that we expected and said, yes, the minimum wage has to go up. But there's a very large component of working-class Hispanic kids in this school. And they said, if you do that, then you're going to price my father's landscaping business out of the market. Or they said, also on landscaping, because that's a big thing there, why should I, who works with my dad and goes out in the middle of the freezing winter or the broiling summer to do extremely hard work, get paid no more than a cashier in McDonald's? Now, that was a misunderstanding because the minimum wage was going to apply to government employees. But nevertheless, it was a real point. And if you were just having this debate in a kind of a think tank world or something, you'd hear the officially sanctioned correct progressive opinions. But these kids were connecting their real lived experience to these abstract questions. I thought, that's a great civics exercise.
Yeah, it was. There were so many actually really great civics exercises. And I was really impressed just how diverse the opinions were and like how nuanced their positions were in the end. And really, I think this is civics education done well, even if it doesn't look exactly the way that we imagine it would look like.
Well, and I should add one thing, which is kids were getting convinced by each other. Right. And so when I talked to some of them afterwards, they would say, well, I went into this thinking blank. Mm-hmm. And then I listened and I realized I had never really thought about it. I was wrong, so I changed my vote. Great.
Yeah. So what do you think these students think about democracy, if you were to ask them? Or did you, maybe?
I don't know how much they connect their experience in the classroom to this big, giant, capital D word of democracy. And I don't know how much it matters because I think what matters is that they were having a kind of practical experience which showed them what it means to be a citizen in the kind of world we have. And they would say things like, boy, it's so much more complicated than I thought to pass a bill. I thought you just get up there and talk. Or they would say, it really matters how you behave towards people because in order to persuade them, you have to be respectful of their point of view. Well, okay, that's the thing. Okay, whether they call that big D democracy or not, that's the thing. So to me, I would define that as a highly effective civics exercise. And, another thing that kind of runs through the book is that one of the various left-right splits around this subject is conservatives say all these exercises and projects are not intellectually useful, and let's face it, what they really are is attempts to turn the kids into progressive activists. And I either sat in on or know about a fair number of these exercises, and very few of them are like that. And done right, this notion of an absolute divide between book-based learning and experiential learning, book-based learning good, experiential learning bad, or for some people, other way around, some progressives, other way around, is just wrong. It's based on people actually not experiencing the reality they're talking about.
Yeah, well, that really struck me as well in the book that you really need to do both. And really, democracy, as I mentioned in the intro, is not a spectator sport. Like, democracy is an action-based activity. It's an action-based activity. It's an action-based government, right?
We have to,
we have to vote. We don't have to, but it's better if we do show up at town hall meetings. We really understand what our representatives are saying and have an exchange with the people who we have elected to stand up for us.
I don't really get into this in depth, but you could ask, what kind of democracy do you have in mind when you use that word? Because it is true that in a liberal state, the state makes very few affirmative demands for participation of its citizens. Really, outside of serving on a jury, there's very little. Now, I think it probably in my ideal democracy, we would be more participatory and we would feel maybe less alienated from the government way out there somewhere in the misty distance. And so if you think of democracy in more participatory terms, if you think that a healthy democracy actually encourages people, not forces, encourages people to be participatory, then exercises like that are important. If, on the other hand, you think more in small r Republican terms, that what happens in a democracy is that people, in effect, transfer their sovereignty to their elected representative, and it's the elected representative who really does the democratic engagement, well, then the most important question is probably, do you have the knowledge of the issues to vote for the right person? And once you've done that, you're done. But that's not my vision of democracy.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about that in the context of the curriculum that is being taught. And there's a huge plethora of curricula being taught across the country. One of the initiatives that I thought was interesting is the Educating for American Democracy initiative, which brought together scholars across the political spectrum, which is to say bipartisan, to create a shared vision for civic education. And probably this initiative came together under the first Trump administration. So they created a roadmap for high-quality civic education. Tell us more about this.
Well, so one of the reasons why I found this so interesting and frankly appealing is that at a moment of such intense polarization about both what is the American story and how to tell the American story, through a series of, frankly, accidents, the Trump administration, the first term, wound up authorizing a project which ultimately became a project to create some kind, not curriculum, as you say, roadmap, and I'll say in a second what that word means, for the teaching of history and government. And it was one of the premises of the request for proposals for this thing, that it be bipartisan. And so a group originally formed by iCivics, which is a civic instruction provider, and by some academics at Harvard and Tufts, ultimately began working with academics elsewhere, including at Arizona State, who were conservative. And there was a kind of implicit trust that these people had with each other that allowed them to have fights that were productive fights. And so to me, the whole exercise of producing this thing was a civic exercise. I mean, wouldn't it be fascinating to have, instead of a model Congress, a model civics curriculum creation exercise? But that's what it was. And so one of the reasons why it is a roadmap and not a curriculum is you can't make a curriculum in America anymore. Mm-hmm. I mean, I tell the history.
Yes, it's fascinating. The history.
So the history is very interesting. So there have been attempts starting from the 1920s to create a curriculum which all Americans would learn. And they've all come to grief. And they come to grief in the end, not even because we're too divided, we're too various a country. And so there was a very impressive one associated with Columbia Teachers College, which gained a lot of steam in the 1930s. But it was very much a pro-New Deal vision of America. And as the Depression waned and people's sense of hunger, despair, desperation, anger at free market forces also waned, then more and more people began saying, well, I don't want my children to come home and learn that capitalism is bad. And it became a cause célèbre, and it just vanished. Okay, we've had various iterations of this. Other countries can do this. We can't. So what can you do then? Can you just have something vague like standards? Standards are useful. It is important to learn this and that, and then every state has standards. So this was an attempt to somehow create a rigorous course of study that would not be a stipulated curriculum. And so it does some things which I'm not such a big fan of, but I don't see a good way around, which is it says, okay, we're not going to stipulate knowledge. We're going to stipulate the most important questions that need to be asked. Master questions, and then below those more particularized ones. The potential problem with that is that it can just lead to kind of vague conversation because it doesn't say you have to read Federalist 51 or, you have to learn about westward expansion. But we've discovered we have to avoid that thing. So if you can make those questions the kind of questions that you cannot answer without having gained really rich knowledge of the subject matter in question, then you can indirectly lead to the kinds of rich understandings that I believe are indispensable for civic awareness. So this EAD roadmap, as it's called, is very new. It's been rolled out in a small number of places. I went to one, Oklahoma City, just because they were the first school system to use this. And then I encountered reality, which is that in a school system where teachers are paid terribly and are actually have relatively poor academic preparation, students are deeply impoverished, a very high poverty school system, huge number of second language students, well, largely, though not only Latino. And it was mostly discouraging. And I don't think that's because the EAD roadmap got it wrong. I think that's because of problems that lie inside the schools.
Yeah, let's talk about that because this is something that goes throughout your book about essentially the shortcomings of the American school system writ large. You discover, of course, that despite fierce accusations from both sides, really the teachers in the classrooms are doing their best. And I found them, the people that you interviewed, really so earnest and so committed to doing this right that I feel like it's really doing them a disservice that, like you said, a lot of the students cannot really take in the information in the way that they need to in order to participate in the classroom. So you point to the pedagogical problems overlapping with the civic problems, meaning overall there's low literacy among students, which would, of course, naturally mean that they also have low civic literacy. So tell us more about what you found there across the board, because that is really the part that I found discouraging.
So, but let me first, before I do that, get back to something you said a little earlier just now, which is the thing that we hear, that teachers are infusing their kids with doctrine. And this, of course, above all, is a view that the right has. Teachers are progressive, and they're all waving their freak flag. It's not so. I can't say it's never so. In fact, I won't say it's never so. And there's a whole chapter in my book where I think it is so. But that's not the norm, and that's not the problem. Actually, almost all the teachers I talked to said they view it as a kind of moral obligation to not impose their views on kids, to let kids come to their own conclusion. That's very important to know because it's such a right-wing shibboleth, and it's just not so. Mm-hmm. Now, part of the right-wing critique that I share is there is something deeply wrong with our pedagogy, not what we teach, but how we teach. And so let me first say the outcome that I found. So these same schools, like West Chicago High School that has this wonderful civics program, you go into an 11th grade history class there, not the AP class, just the regular old class. And the kids have such profound deficits in terms of their vocabulary, their reading fluency, their stock of knowledge. And this is not an inner city school. This is a suburban school that sends its kids off to college. Part of it is a second language issue, but not only. I spent a lot of time in high school, but also middle school and elementary school, history, social studies classes. And what I tended to find was that the best of them, which are almost always advanced placement or international baccalaureate classes, kids were reading books, they were thinking thoughts, they were having conversations. It was really great. Outside of that relatively small world, I would find, for example, that the kids would be reading the Declaration of Independence, and it was just hard for them. And the Declaration of Independence is not written at that difficult a level. I mean, I understand that kids find it hard to read the Federalist Papers. If you ever bother to read them, you'll see their syntax is complicated. It's really not easy. We'd like kids to be able to read that by the time they're in, let's say, 11th grade, but it is hard. But if they can't easily read the preamble to the Constitution, or the Declaration, or primary documents of any kind, letters the founders wrote to each other, any more complex document, well, then the idea that we can be having a discussion about these things is kind of meaningless. And what tends to happen in those classes is that discussion becomes something like, how do we feel about this? Or what would it be like to be a pilgrim or a founder or something? Though those are useful exercises if they build on knowledge, if they are ways of evading the fact that the kids don't have the knowledge to talk about the documents themselves, then it's just happy time. You know, I found that the classes tended to be either silent, there were just painful moments. Mm-hmm. Painful for the teacher, painful for the kids, painful for me watching, of silence, or this kind of happy talk that gave the impression that we're having a discussion, but they were kind of having a discussion about nothing.
Well, I just want to say on the painful part, I think all of us have been in these classes, even though, you know, we grew up several decades ago in school and we read more books than people do today. I have also been in that class where nobody knew the answer and nobody was going to participate.
Yeah, I mean, of course. And maybe I shouldn't get too hysterical about it, but it was very upsetting for the teacher. And I was often in these situations where the teacher would be saying something like, and I was there, so to some extent it probably increases the wish to show off and the fear of failing.
Yes.
So, okay. Let's talk about the Reconstruction, which we talked about yesterday. You know, what are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments? Blank.
Yes.
And this would reduce the teacher to despair. I mean, this is a specific class I was in, and she came over to me and said, I promise you, we talked about this yesterday. Now, maybe she's not a good teacher, though I had the impression she was a good teacher. But the combination of kids not having gained this kinds of deep knowledge when young, to have the kind of really solid skills, to have the vocabulary and the reading fluency and the stock of knowledge when young, not having the patience to read anything at length, which we can blame on social media, but also maybe on their poor prior education, parents who get mad when their kids bring home too much work or don't get good grades. All sorts of things create pressures towards a least common denominator. And that's the result I saw in classrooms.
We'll be back with James in just a moment, so stick around. You'll want to hear this episode's Civic Spark. One small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, we want to share about a podcast we know you'll enjoy because you have already enjoyed it. It's Shifting Terrain.
America's working class is something you usually hear about every election cycle. But is anyone really paying attention to the largest demographic in America in between elections? In Season 2 of Shifting Terrain, we expose the forces both capturing and dividing the working class. I'm your host, sociologist Rachel Rybacek. Shifting Terrain moves beyond simplistic stereotypes to amplify the cultural, political, and economic issues facing America's working class today. Shifting Terrain is available wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, let's return to my conversation with James Traub. Well, let's turn to kind of an unexpected bright light, which is classical schools. You went to visit several of them. They focus on great books and character formation, which seems to produce students who are capable of deeper engagement with ideas and civic questions. And this happily even applies in low-income demographics. I was really struck by the example in Mesquite, Texas. So democracy, of course, requires more than just knowing facts, right? It requires judgment, deliberation, moral reasoning. And in fact, that's where you place the future of civic education. I'm going to quote you now. Towards the end of your book, you say, quote, "The democratic dispositions that students acquire will be hollow in the absence of language and knowledge. There and not elsewhere is the frontier of civic education." End quote. So that almost sounds like you're saying we should focus more on delivering high-quality education across the board as opposed to focusing on a civics curriculum. And we talked a little bit about this already. But what kind of person does democracy need? And how do we form that person?
There are at least two different questions there. One is, do I say that high-quality education is more important than civics instruction? And the answer is no, I don't say that explicitly. Actually, no, I think the important thing to say is that these are not two things that are exclusive of each other. Mm-hmm. Because the point I make about these classical schools is that none of them have a class called civics.
Right.
Everything about the school is designed to shape a good citizen. These people have all read Aristotle. They're all very aware of the idea of what it means to live in a republic and of the kinds of virtues that you need to live in a republican world. And they've read the Latin classics as well. And so they would say that if we expose children at a very young age to great, beautiful language, beautiful content is one of the words they use, to beautiful content, we even ask them to do old-fashioned things like memorize and recite in front of others. These, well, of course, would strike a progressive educator as terribly archaic. That learning becomes a thing that they actually can begin to do for themselves and enjoy, and doesn't feel like some kind of sort of terrible imposition. And I think progressive education tends to think that learning facts is a deadening exercise. We're shoving facts down their throat. It's drill and kill. Well, that's not how it feels in these classical schools. So if you're in a sixth grade class where the kids are reading a real live novel, not a YA novel, a real live novel, The Count of Monte Cristo, a beautiful novel, and the kids can get up and say, okay, we all read chapter 8 today, and here's what I think was going on in chapter 8. And I was sitting in this class. The girl gives a very nice summary of the chapter. And then she says, does anybody have any questions? And kids ask questions, and there's a conversation. You think, well, these kids aren't geniuses. This isn't private school. The kids who come from this middle class, not wealthy suburb of Dallas, there's nothing special about them. Other kids could be doing the same thing. And so for me, the pedagogical question of how you teach is central. Now, classical schools, almost all pay fealty to, are based on the ideas that someone like E.D. Hirsch, who wrote about core knowledge, which is to say that it is wrong to think that the way to learn is through mastering generalizable skills like finding the main idea. No, you gain those skills through a deep immersion in particular things. And this deep immersion through learning words, vocabulary, and facts, gaining knowledge, gives you the fluency and comfort level to work your way through a difficult text and to do things like find the main idea and ask critical questions and so forth. And so underneath all this other stuff is a certain view of pedagogy, which I think is right, and a critique of our conventional pedagogy, which I think is mostly wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I grew up in a place where there is a federal or a nationwide curriculum that everybody must learn and everybody must do things like memorize and recite poetry. But it's the kind of thing where I find as a, somebody who came here as a student, I thought, why do they do it this way? Why doesn't everybody have the same basic knowledge, whether that's algebra or whether it's reading certain books? And I think there are some books that everybody should have read by the time they're a certain age.
Nobody reads books.
Nobody.
Books are 20th century. I mean, if
well, my kids read books and they're young people.
Well, but so, if I were to give one piece of advice, I think it would be read books.
Right.
I mean, you would think, well, okay, they're doing that, right? And the answer is no. A book, a physical book, or even if, let's say a book in your computer, that's
right.
Okay. This is a very rare thing. Of course, in junior high school, but even in high school, the land of books tends to be the AP class or the International Baccalaureate class. Otherwise, what happens? The teacher says, you can find online pages 21 to 24 of, a Toni Morrison novel or something. I mean, it's not like they're not reading valuable material, but just they
not
can't
reading the whole
assign a
book.
Kids don't have the patience to read a whole book. It's too much to ask. And by the time they're in high school, it's too late.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these are habits that we have to put down early, and school does not push back hard enough against the forces in the culture that are making it very difficult to get kids to do things like read books.
So I think you have just described the democracy man as opposed to, let's say, the Renaissance man, although the Renaissance man, of course, reads books too.
Well, the Renaissance man is also an aristocrat. I mean, part of the problem with democracy man, not the problem, the burden, is that older notions of raising citizens assumed an elite. So when I think about 19th century American education, these questions were really central. What does it mean to be educated for democracy? But then there is a separate question. Democratic education, meaning everyone must be educated. How do you provide an education for democracy, not to an elite, but to everyone? Otherwise, it's not a democracy. That's very difficult. And one way of looking at the history of this is to see that in the early decades of the 20th century, when first the country was expanding immensely because of immigration, and these people were newcomers, and we had this increasing recognition as we became an industrial as opposed to a rural society that it was really important to go to school. Everybody had to go to school at least through 16, and more graduate from high school. So we had this new mandate. Everyone must become educated up to a certain point, and we have millions of new people. Well, that made this old, somewhat more aristocratic form of education inapplicable, or so it seemed. And the methods we adopted had much more to do with getting people adapted to industrial society, getting them a degree, making them good citizens in the sense of being compliant. And so I think one way of looking at it maybe is that this older idea, the Renaissance idea of liberal education is a Renaissance term, never quite survived the movement into mass education, democratic education in that sense. And so I suppose what I'm trying to do is to revive a notion of education for democracy in a truly democratic world where everybody has to be educated.
Yeah, I think that's amazing and commendable. But like in the current climate of the culture wars and states, because states here in this country determine what gets taught, I don't know whether there's really the political will for this. If you look at Florida, for example, it seems impossible to think that this is the place where they're going to actually have these kinds of standards in terms of the pedagogy.
So here's an interesting contradiction at the heart of the conservative critique. Mm-hmm. Florida being a perfect example. The conservatives, of course, they're up in arms about progressive education, and they think kids have to learn facts and knowledge. And if you look at the standards that are written by some of the most ideological conservatives, they're very rigorous, and they're very focused on gaining knowledge. I think good. But then, because today's conservatism is so profoundly a cultural artifact, and there is this culture war that they must be fighting, the mandates, the edicts that you see in a place like Florida make good teaching impossible. Mm-hmm. And so one of my chapters comes out of the experience I had of being at the Florida Annual Social Studies Teachers Conference. And the teachers would gather around me and say, hey, does he know about the rule about nicknames? I said, no, I don't know about the rule. And they would tell me these crazy things. Nicknames is the following crazy thing, which is in order to prevent the situation where a child is having doubts about his or her gender and has asked his teachers to call him or her by a different name, Florida has passed a state law which prohibits teachers from calling students by any name other than the one that is formally listed on the attendance rolls. If your name is Robert, I cannot call you Bobby without getting permission from your parents. And so this mass of mandates and rules designed to prevent wokeness also has the effect of making the kinds of discussion and debate so fraught, because I'm not even adding things like the prohibition on certain controversial subjects, all of which have to do with race and gender. You can't talk about them. And if you do talk about them, what if your kid comes home and says, Mom, Mrs. Jackson, talked to us about LGBTQ. And then the mother is enraged and calls the principal, and the principal calls you on the carpet, or there's an article in the newspaper. Well, the best thing to do is just avoid it. Don't talk about anything difficult. And that's the strategy teachers tend to adopt.
Yeah, so I have a larger philosophical question here, which is that how can schools pick up the slack, so to speak, if the civic culture all around them has already collapsed, whether that's in families or in popular culture? And that's the question.
As public institutions, it is right that they are permeable to the public and that they are not seen by parents as adverse to their own culture. And so schools tend to be kind of helpless in that regard. The schools that I admire, like these classical schools, have a kind of countercultural quality to them. Not the way we usually use that word, and not even really in the political sense. That's not really what it's about. It's that, in effect, they say, we can't do anything about your world outside. And you may spend 7 hours a day on social media. We can't stop that. In here, we have a different world. You put your phone in your locker when you come in the morning, and you cannot look at it again until the end of the day. They have uniforms, they have rules, they have a lot of things that kids I know in New York City would say, I'd sooner die, right? These are not going to work in a lot of places. Although I'd love to know what a progressive classical school would look like. I don't think that's impossible in the least. But I think the fair question would be, how much can we expect schools to work against the grain of an increasingly pernicious culture? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I can say, this is what I think is the problem. Mm-hmm. Here are some examples of solutions. But I don't have the illusion that schools by themselves can somehow drain the toxins from our culture. But at the very least, we don't want them to be reproducing the worst aspects of our culture. We want them to have a set of values of their own, not political values, but values about what it means to be educated that will, to some extent, serve as walls and not just membranes in regard to the larger world.
Well, we are a podcast that aims to inspire civic action. So every week I ask my guests to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. So what's a good way to turn the insights that you've just shared with us from all the experiences you've had in being in these classrooms into action?
So action, this world I'm writing about, the action is action kind of inside your brain. So there are myriad kinds of actions that I would like citizens to engage in. But in the world of this book, I would like people to think that we are not rendered helpless by our technology, by things like social media, that we can push back against that, and we must. And we have to think of schools as a place that stand apart from that cognitively corrosive process of social media. And we have to give them the space to do that. Schools are under such pressure from parents who make such demands of them, and we have to allow schools to be something that stand apart from some of the more pernicious aspects of our own world. I would put it that way.
Thank you. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
What makes me hopeful are the good things I saw. And so in terms of classical schools, they're really expanding rapidly, but they're only expanding rapidly in the red world. I want classical schools in the blue world.
They exist.
They exist. They do exist.
Yes.
They do exist. The New
I want
Yorker,
to tell you, my children went to a school like that. But
good.
Not, yeah,
well,
it's
the
a
New
private
Yorker
school.
wrote a piece about an inner city school in the Bronx that's a classical school. Good. Great. More. I know about ones in the inner city Minneapolis. So let 1,000 flowers bloom. And then the fact that we have more and more really high-quality providers of instructional material. There's so many of them now, and many of them are really great. And so it's one good thing that if you are a teacher and you find that the textbook you have just doesn't give you anything really useful about, the Dred Scott case or something, you can find great material really easily and free. And that's not a substitute for the curriculum you grew up with, where everybody would have to know about that. But given our own limitations, that's an encouraging thing.
Well said. Thank you so much, James, for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, it was a lot of fun for me. Thank you.
James Traub is the author of The Cradle of Citizenship: How Schools Can Help Save Our Democracy. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Thinking is an action, so remind yourself that we're not rendered helpless by the ills of technology and social media, despite how often we hear that it is ruining our lives. Push back, especially in places like your children's school. Next week on Future Hindsight, we'll be joined by Daniel Hunter. He's an organizer, strategist with Training for Change, and a consummate educator. His activist training tools are everywhere, spread over his years as a training elder with Training for Change and training director with 350.org. That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. And if you're listening on your browser, you can find Future Hindsight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast app. We're here to build your civic action toolkit every week, so follow Future Hindsight now, and we'll come right to you. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent pro-democracy podcast, please subscribe to the Civics Club on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/Future Hindsight now to join. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack, Travis, and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,